Welcome back, everyone. I am so incredibly excited to guide you through today's explainer because we're going to unpack the story of a nation completely defined by extreme dualities. We're looking at Ecuador. Now, on the surface, it's this country of breathtaking beauty, right? Profound biodiversity. But when you look a little closer at the historical, political, and social forces that really shaped it, well, you find a total crucible of contrasts. It's literally a place defined by a constant historical tug of war. We're talking ancient traditions versus modern globalization, extreme wealth sitting right next to enduring poverty, and vast ecological treasures under intense economic pressures.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. Roots of a diverse nation. 2. Conquest and the Republic. 3. A century of turmoil. 4. Rise of social movements. And finally, 5. The modern tug of war.
So let's start with Section 1, Roots of a Diverse Nation. Ecuador is actually the smallest Spanish-speaking nation in South America, but man, it packs an incredibly diverse set of geographic zones. You've got the coastal plains right along the Pacific, the high-altitude mountainous Sierra of the Andes, the super lush eastern tropical lowlands of the Amazon basin, and of course, you can't forget the world-famous Galapagos Islands. And this rich, highly concentrated biodiversity didn't just shape the environment. It actually set the perfect stage for some of the absolute most ancient settled communities in the New World, way, way before the Inca Empire even expanded into the region.
But as you might guess, that ancient balance was shattered pretty quickly. In 1532, Spanish forces led by Francisco Pizarro arrived, and they captured the Inca emperor, Atahualpa. Now, despite a massive ransom of gold and silver being paid out, Atahualpa was executed anyway in 1533. And this marked a deeply traumatic, violent shift from these vast indigenous empires to literally centuries of Spanish colonial rule. It actually wasn't until May 1822 that independence from Spanish rule was finally declared. And then, after a brief stint as part of the Gran Colombia Federation, the independent Republic of Ecuador officially emerged in 1830.
Moving on to Section 2, Conquest and the Republic.
So, late 19th century hits, and the political landscape of Ecuador becomes highly polarized. It's basically a bitter tug of war. On one side, you've got this traditional conservative ruling elite. They often employed strict censorship and authoritarian measures, mostly trying to maintain order and national unity. But then, on the flip side, you had these increasingly influential liberal politicians. They were pushing really hard for governmental reform, economic liberalization, and just a general break from those traditional, heavily centralized structures. As you'd expect, this intense friction frequently boiled over into straight-up uprisings and civil strife.
And external shocks just completely inflamed these internal tensions. 50,000, that is the number of square kilometers of territory that Ecuador lost to Peru. Yeah, 50,000. Following an armed conflict in the early 1940s, a treaty officially recognized Peru's territorial integrity over this massive tract of land. And this brilliantly illustrates a dramatic turning point. That loss was deeply traumatic for Ecuador, fueling this really profound sense of national grievance and political instability that echoed for decades.
But, it wasn't just border conflicts causing all this instability. It was global markets, too. Ecuador's economy became super dependent on agricultural exports. So when there was a steep decline in world banana prices in the mid-1920s, it caused a massive internal economic crisis. The government at the time, totally unable to handle a fallout, and that opened the door for a military junta to overthrow the leadership. Keep this in mind because this is a recurring theme we're going to see over and over: global economic fluctuations directly dictating domestic political survival.
All right, Section 3. A century of turmoil.
Now, consider this paradox for a second. How did an oil boom lead to a banking collapse? Sounds crazy, right? Ecuador discovered significant oil reserves, which sparked this huge boom in the 1970s. But somehow, by 1999, the country was facing an entirely unprecedented economic disaster. Let's walk through exactly how that domino effect actually happened. Step 1. Global oil prices declined. Since Ecuador was now heavily reliant on oil revenues just to service massive foreign debts, this exogenous shock was absolutely devastating. Step 2, the financial system, which was already pretty fragile, suffered a massive loss of liquidity. Step 3, panic sets in. Between August and October of 1999, whole cities were literally bankrupted by a massive wave of bank runs. And finally, step 4, the currency collapsed. This triggered hyperinflation, ultimately forcing the country into this drastic overnight shift to adopt the US dollar as its official currency, just to stabilize the economy.
The human cost of these economic adjustments and neoliberal policies was just staggering. Following this phase, 70% of the population found themselves in the informal economy. Let that sink in. That means the vast majority of workers were out there surviving without any employment protections, without formal benefits, and they were entirely vulnerable to whatever the next economic shock might be.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how it highlights a massive systemic gap in public resources. See, according to Ecuador's constitution, healthcare is officially recognized as a universal right. However, the reality of the two major public providers tells a completely different story. While they do cover roughly 60% of the population, which is about 11.48 million people, the average investment is only $135 per person per year. It perfectly captures that tension between the legal promise of universal rights and the stark, on-the-ground reality of severe economic limitations.
Which brings us to Section 4, Rise of Social Movements.
So out of all this marginalization emerged some incredibly powerful organized resistance. The most prominent example of this is CONIA. They are the umbrella organization for the indigenous social movements of Ecuador. For literally hundreds of years, indigenous populations were largely excluded from the economic and political spheres. But by the 1990s, CONIA successfully united regional federations from the Sierra, the coast, and the Amazonas. They took those shared struggles against the state and neoliberal policies and transformed them into a fierce, unified, and highly effective political force.
But we have to acknowledge that the challenges facing these social movements are deeply, deeply entrenched. Illiteracy still persists heavily in specific provinces. For instance, Manabí has nearly 45,000 illiterate individuals, Pichincha is at 40,000, and Guayas is at 30,000. Despite several historical literacy campaigns dating all the way back to the 1940s, these educational gaps endure, especially in rural, impoverished zones. These numbers really represent the ongoing uphill battle that social movements face when advocating for truly equitable development.
Even with those hurdles, though, the power of these grassroots movements absolutely cannot be overstated. Civil society had found its voice and hand. I love this quote because it perfectly encapsulates the climax of this social power. In April 2005, President Lucio Gutierrez was trying to push through these deeply unpopular IMF reforms, and he faced widespread, intense street demonstrations. The pressure from everyday citizens and social organizations got so immense that it directly led to his ousting. It proved without a doubt that the people, when they're truly unified, could literally topple a government.
And that leads us to our final section, Section 5, the modern tug of war.
90%. So the crucial point is that it's estimated that more than 90% of Ecuador's western lowland humid tropical forest has been completely transformed by human activity. For a country celebrated all over the globe for its biodiversity, this figure is just absolutely devastating.
And look, this isn't some new problem, right? It's the result of a long historical timeline of extraction. Deforestation actually began with 15th-century Amazon colonization. Then it accelerated in the late 19th century with oil drilling near the Napo River. It expanded again in the late 20th century when they built the Trans-Ecuadorian pipeline. And most recently, there's been a massive palm oil boom that's threatening the incredibly biodiverse Choco area. This ongoing quest for economic growth and debt relief has continually placed a giant target on Ecuador's unique environment.
Let's move to see how all this builds together. It brings us to the central thesis of our explainer. Ecuador remains caught in a fundamental tug of war. On one side, the nation is pressured heavily toward global economic integration, which, as we've seen, relies on foreign capital and aggressive resource extraction. But then, on the very same soil, you've got these powerful, unified movements demanding internal democratic reforms, environmental protection, and the honoring of indigenous rights. It's a constant push and pull that literally defines every major political decision in the country.
So, what does this all mean for the future? Which leaves us with a final, provocative question. Will Ecuador succumb to external pressures and its cycle of historical instability, or can its deeply diverse people forge a unified, sustainable future? The ingredients for both outcomes are deeply woven right into the nation's fabric. It's a complex, absolutely fascinating story, and the crazy part is, it's still being written. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep seeking the facts, keep looking at the structures behind the story, and I'll see you next time.